Okay, welcome. I think we're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to let some folks get seated here and then begin the program for this afternoon. So welcome to all of you this afternoon. My name is Rosemary Bott. I'm on the faculty of the ILR School of Cornell, and I have the great honor to moderate this panel of distinguished guests. And this session is called Democracy on the Defense, What's the Economy Got to Do with It? So we're going to go deeply into thinking about how the political economy of the United States have changed, and in turn, how we are responding to it. What are the examples that many of the people on this panel can point to and that will stimulate our thinking. And then we also want to make sure we leave about 40 minutes or so for people to come up to the mic and have their input. So please think about your questions and your comments, jot them down so that then we can really have a robust conversation after the panel is finished. I'm going to start with introducing folks. As I said, I'm Rosemary Bott from the faculty at the ILR School, and the four panelists include first Derek Seidman, who is a writer, researcher, and historian in Buffalo. He's the former research director of a corporate watchdog group that is a really fabulous group called Little Sis, which has, if you don't know the organization, please go to their website. It's fantastic. It provides great resources for organizing and activism. Over the last decade, he's done research and writing on corporate power, the labor movement, and the fossil fuel industry and U.S. militarism. Then we move on to two representatives from Demos, which is a fabulous organization that is a nonprofit public policy organization working to build a just, inclusive economy. They have worked for over 25 years at an intersectional agenda to bring together Black and brown communities and forge strategic alliances. So let me start first with Udochi Onwubiko, who is the Director of Economic Justice at Demos, and she joined in September, and prior to that spent about a decade in economic justice policy. She served in the Biden-Harris administration as a labor policy advisor to the Office of the Vice President and senior policy advisor in the Wage and Hour Division. Moving on then to Nita Kashku, Associate Director of Demos Democracy Project, and she has been there for nearly a year doing work in public interest law, social justice advocacy, and nonprofit management. She most recently, prior to Demos, served as the policy director for an academic center focusing on advancing racial justice, and before that, a staff attorney at the nonprofit organization dedicated to abolishing criminal legal debt. And then our last speaker in the middle is Shelley Mayer, the New York State Senator of the 37th Senate District and chair of the Committee on Education. She has spent a long career advocating for New Yorkers. She was elected to the New York Senate in April of 2018 and was subsequently reelected in 2020, and 2022. And she has been a champion for children in public schools throughout her time in the Senate. And before that, she serves as the chair of the Assembly Education Subcommittee for Students with Special Needs. And before that, representing the city of Yonkers in the Assembly and prioritizing the delivery of the city's 26,000 public school students. So each of these people who've had deep experience in mobilizing and representing the interests of working people and communities are going to try to present different perspectives on 3 questions that we've identified. And so the questions are something very simple, which is, first of all, why are we here? What are the political and economic challenges, and how did we get here? Second, then what kind of community mobilizing, grassroots mobilizing is going on that can provide opportunities to really change the balance of power. And then third, we're going to move more into political and policy opportunities. What are the best ideas around policy solutions? So before I turn it over to our panelists, I want to say just a couple things around framing. I was asked to kind of draw on my research and experience, and I have 2 points. The first is that 50 years ago this summer, we impeached Richard Nixon. And that's a factoid, and I was working in Washington for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and in July 20th, we came down with the articles of impeachment, and a month later, Nixon resigned. And we all thought, woo, woo, the revolution will be televised. But how wrong were we? And what we saw was an incredible backlash, right, by the right, very well organized. And in trying to frame the discussion, I have my way of thinking about the last 50 years is in 2 stages of what I call financialization. So the right was determined to overturn the New Deal and the social compacts that had been formed in that era. And they did so in 2 ways. First, rhetorically, obviously through ideology and the culture wars, but second, by systematically going after our local, state, and federal institutions to take control of them. And so I think that is a very powerful way of thinking about what their strategic agenda has been and how we can fight back. The second thing I want to say is about framing what has happened. And I think of it in terms of financialization. And financialization is just not a very good word for saying finance taking over our economy and polity. So financial actors, thinking, logic, seeping into our everyday life and taking control of how decisions are made. And I think of it in 2 stages. The first stage, which many of us have talked about, is about corporate takeover. And here we need, in particular, the shareholder value model. So now companies only maximize shareholder value, and there's no kind of social or labor deal that the pie should be shared more equally. And so we have the maximization of stock price at all costs. And we saw that through the deregulation of industries, the deregulation of unions through deunionization and undermining labor law, and we saw it through the deregulation of banking, which culminated in the Clinton years. That's what I call financialization 1.0. We're now in financialization 2.0, which is much more hidden. And when people alluded to private equity, what is private equity, right? Based on the undermining of our financial regulations, what has emerged from about 2000 till now are hidden actors, unregulated actors, using private pools of capital to control our economy. And private equity, hedge funds, venture capital, asset managers taking over, taking control of companies, shaking them out, extracting wealth, and leaving them often bankrupt. And so if you think of Toys R Us or Red Lobster recently, et cetera, those are all private equity stories, Top Supermarket. And yet we blame the companies. Oh, it's corporate power, but it's not. It's really financial power and I call it the puppeteers behind the puppets who are pulling the strings, and it makes it much harder to organize against them because they're hidden. And so I think what we now have is two. We certainly continue to have corporate power, but we also have financial power that is much more hidden and unregulated, and they are driving the billions going into the right-wing agenda. So I hope this may provide a little bit of a framing for what we've seen in the last 50 years. Derek is really going to pick up on these themes. I'm going to turn it over to him to start first, and then move through some of the other, each of the other panelists. And so the first question is about the challenges posed by this kind of political economy that we now are experiencing. So, Derek.
Hey, can everybody hear me? Oh, yeah, okay.
Yes.
So the problem is it's capitalism. So I think we can just like go to the bar now, right? Okay. Joking, not joking. We're joking. I do a lot of journalism, and one of the great things about it is I get to interview and talk to a lot of really interesting people, a lot of inspiring people. I did something last year where I did a long interview with a sociologist named Heather Gottney, who wrote this really wonderful new book called The New Power Elite. It was a sort of update of the classic work by C. Wright Mills, The Power Elite. I think it was written sometime in the 50s. And she was an advisor in Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign, and she had all kinds of, really insightful formulations to talk about sort of the kind of situation we're in. And one thing that she said was she referred to the sort of forces that have produced the society that we live in today as a, quote, concerted elite class project. And I don't think she was necessarily talking about a bunch of people sitting in a room and forming a conspiracy, but she was talking about really, kind of what Rose was referring to, this sort of corporate offensive that began a half century ago in the 1970s. I mean, not that everything was roses before then, but, there was a crisis moment in the 1970s, stagflation, wildcat strikes ripping across the country, Vietnam War, so on and so on. And so out of that moment, you get this new, sort of more strategic, more concerted mobilization of business power, the creation of new think tanks, the creation of new donor networks. You have these symbolic moments like the crushing of the air traffic controller strike in 1981, and so on and so on. This is a project that is pushing things like deregulation, privatization. Let's roll back, if not crush unions, and financialization. And you fast forward. This is roughly the situation that we're living in today, right? And I should also say that part of that was also disarming the opposition, and again, a lot of that meant attacking the labor movement. And so, Rose mentioned private equity. Do people know what private equity is? Okay, so some do. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that's helpful to talk about because it's maybe the most sort of potent expression of this logic of this balance of power that we live in today. I feel like, I wish private equity was around when Karl Marx wrote Capital, because like can't think of anything that sort of embodies the kind of ruthless ethic of capital accumulation like private equity. But I mean, it's basically billionaire investors in pouring money, acquiring companies, often private companies, little scrutiny, little transparency, little visibility. And probably most of us in this room haven't even heard of a lot of the big private equity giants like Blackstone or Carlyle or Macquarie or KKR. I'm sure some of us have, right? They have a really sort of parasitic business model that Rose mentioned, right? You sort of buy up companies, preferably vulnerable companies. You load them up with debt. You restructure. All of this often, what this means is this happens on the backs of workers, mass layoffs, and you do this all so you can, give big payoffs to investors, right? And right now, another person I was interviewing a couple of times for a few different things was a Swedish geographer named Brett Christophers, who's written some really wonderful sort of big picture stuff about private equity and kind of asset managers more generally, and how they've really come to dominate us. And he wrote a book, and a great title, it's called Our Lives in Their Portfolios. One of the statistics that he brings up is that as of 2021, asset managers, and these are private equity firms, but also more passive index asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard and so on, and not just in the U.S. but all around the world, but mostly private controlled, right? Have around $108 trillion of assets under management, right? That's around, to put it in perspective, that's around 10 times the GDPs, that's around 2 times the GDPs of the top 10 countries in the world, including the US combined, right? So just like an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of, capacity for investment, almost completely in private hands, right? One of the interesting things that he said in one of our interviews was that, one of the problems that we have today is that governments, a lot of us in this room, I'm sure, especially been around, labor movement or housing struggles or whatever, private equity is the villain, right? But he said governments, including U.S. government, see private equity as the solution, not the problem, right? And I'm quoting him here. He says, the problem isn't so much asset managers, he's talking about private equity as part of that, but that governments have outsourced all of our significant problems to asset managers rather than grappling with them themselves. And what he's really talking about is, that we don't really, a lack of public investment, right? We see private equity in its takeovers having destructive effects on, almost everywhere, right? Driving up housing costs, propping up dirty fossil fuel infrastructure that could have otherwise, been converted or something. And it's not just that, also, just incidentally, go look at any private equity firm's energy portfolio. Half of it now is green energy. So when you hear green transition, we have to remember that this is something that, who's going to own the green transition, right? Is it going to be something that's controlled by private equity, or is it going to be something that's publicly, democratically controlled, where communities have impact, communities and workers have input into it, and so on. They have monopolies over prison telecommunications. So if you're incarcerated, it's $10 to send an email. Though there's been sort of heroic work to have regulations to challenge some of that. Rose knows a lot about hospitals and senior care, private equity gobbling up that. I mean, private equity in control of your healthcare. What could go wrong, right? It destroys jobs too, right? There's been a number of reports. There was a great one a couple of years ago by United for Respect and a couple of groups that looked at how, I think the number was like 1.1 million retail jobs, mostly retail, but other jobs have been destroyed by private equity. Rose mentioned Toys R Us. For those of you under 25, Toys R Us was something called a store, and they sold toys, but great place, a lot of good childhood memories. Thanks, private equity. Someone else I interviewed was a guy named Les Leopold. He runs this place called the Worker Institute in New Jersey. It's like a kind of popular education, kind of training place that works with the labor movement. And he just wrote this really interesting book that really makes this connection between private equity and mass layoffs. And I can't remember all the statistics at hand about the numbers of mass layoffs, but he said crunching this to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which keeps statistics around mass layoffs. He said between 1996 to 2012, 20 million people in the U.S. experienced mass layoffs. And it was often the case that these were, he connects these mass layoffs to private equity, buyouts, restructuring, things like that. And in turn, he also really maps where these are happening with districts, particularly around, Great Lakes, Midwest states that swung from Democratic to Republican, right? So he is trying to draw the connection between mass layoffs and the far right, and the rise of the far right. And so, but it's not just private equity. You look at the jobs that are growing today, top 10, top 20 jobs. It's employers like Amazon, like Walmart, FedEx, Target, Home Depot, places that are, often tyrannical workplaces, no unions, or very few unions. Starbucks is up there too. Thankfully, that's things are changing there. We'll see what happens at Amazon, right? So just, you see this kind of crisis of like democracy, transparency in all kinds of places, in the corporate world, in the world of work, in politics. And just to bring it back to home real quick, and then I'll pass it off. This is something, we really experience in Buffalo, this sort of corporate domination of political economy, right? Like, so some of you, if you're from out of town, the Buffalo Bills are like it's like a religion here, right? If you said to me like, Derek, the Revolution, Bills Super Bowl win. Firstborn child. When people from Buffalo are alone, without people from outside Buffalo, we just speak two words to each other. We're just like, Josh Allen, Josh Allen, Josh Allen, Josh Allen. No, okay. But the Bills just agreed. They just agreed to a new stadium that they're building in Buffalo, and I think Investigative Post last I saw it was like 1.12 billion in subsidies, that is going to be given to this stadium. And this is a team that's owned by a fracking billionaire whose net worth is $8 billion. It's not unique to Buffalo, right? This is happening all over the place. But the point is that these people can come in and threaten disinvestment. And I mean, what Buffalo would have paid $2 billion, it would have paid $3 billion. I mean, it's just like, people would not do anything to keep the Bills here, right? But the point is, it's this really sort of parasitic stuff, and we see this with the whole Tesla, plant in South Buffalo too. It's just been the Buffalo billion, in subsidies that was promised, and it's really sort of underperforming. There's been a lot of union busting there. So, anyways, I know that's a lot, but keep the discussion going.
Thank you. And so again, for each of you to think about from your perspective where you are, what are the challenges that you really see? And we're going to move to Udochi. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think there are a lot of challenges, but one I want to really hone in on is what seems to be an unwillingness to reckon with history and to recognize that we have an economic system that is rooted in racism, right? Because we cannot talk about an inclusive economy unless we're talking about understanding who's excluded and why. We can't talk about a just economy until we're talking about who's treated unfairly and why. There was someone who asked a question yesterday, and I believe she started with, when people say that the system is broken, I say, no, it's working exactly how it's intended. And I think no true words have been spoken, right? And I always think about one example from history that really underscores that the economy is working how it's supposed to work. So, quick history lesson, 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in Congress, and that's a federal law that establishes a minimum wage and overtime protections. But certain industries were excluded from those protections. Ag workers, service workers, restaurant workers, domestic workers. Why were these industries excluded? Because that is where most Black and brown people were working at the time. And it was easy for Congress to have this facially, on its face, It is race neutral to say we're not going to include ag. But everybody knew, and the intention was, we're doing this because we do not want black workers to have the same wage protections as white workers, because that will lead to some form of equality. And so we codified racial income inequality, and guess what we got? We got 80 years of racial income inequality. And even though some of those industries are now protected to a certain extent, damage has been done, right? Like, those industries we know are still low-wage industries, and we still know because of occupational segregation, that's where a lot of black people work as well. So it's a very clear example of this is how our economy was set up. We know from the record that it was intentional. There were people who got on the House floor and said out loud, I don't want black people to have the same wages as white people because that will mean equality. Like, we know that was the intent, and that was what we got. And so if we're not reckoning with that history, it's really hard to think of solutions. How do we actually change an economy in the way that works with and for black and brown people? And I have a very specific example of trying to do a hearing on this issue of exclusion of black and brown workers in basic wage laws, and just getting the okay to say in a hearing titled the word racism was a battle. Getting people to feel comfortable saying out loud that this is based in racism was a battle. And I think we do ourselves a huge disservice by not recognizing and struggling and being uncomfortable with what it means and how do we get closer to a better economy. The second thing I will flag is I think we have a lot of decision makers who aren't prioritizing the public good at all. So riddle me this: in what world could you go for an interview, sit across from the interviewer and say, I don't believe in your organization. In fact, if you hire me, I'm going to do everything I can to dismantle and undermine your organization from the inside out. You would not get that job. But yet we have policymakers who do not believe in government. They do not believe in the power of the government to help people. They are not prioritizing the public good. And because of that, we get decision makers that are prioritizing corporate interests over the interests of workers. And the result is an economy that is not benefiting workers in the way that it needs to. So I think that we need to be very mindful of how that shows up. A really good example of how it shows up is the regulatory process and the regulatory system, especially at the federal level, especially because Congress doesn't get a lot done, especially in the workers' rights space. The regulatory space is where a lot of things happen. And I'm sure folks remember during the Trump administration was very set on deregulating and to rolling back protections for workers. The work that I did was focusing specifically just on one agency, the agency that enforces minimum wage, overtime, and other worker wage and hour protections. And in the course of maybe his first 2 years, he rolled back tried to roll back several baseline protections. He chose to prioritize corporate interests ahead of workers. And we see that when there's this basic struggle of keeping the basic protections that were codified 80 years ago, we can't build on progress. We can't move forward. We can't do better for workers because we're spending so much time just holding on to the few, arguably very limited protections that we have. And I think that really erodes our ability to have an economy that works for everyone.
Thank you so much, Udochi. So, Nita, if you can bring in your experience and perspective.
Yeah, absolutely happy to. Building on the excellent remarks that have already been shared, in my work, I think a lot about what this means for voting rights, right? For the way that our democracy is supposed to function. And fundamentally, you have a campaign finance system that incentivizes elected officials to prioritize the interests of these interests we've been talking about, these big corporate, private equity, ultra wealthy interests, right? At the expense of workers' rights, right? Because those two things are incompatible in their mind. And when you're only thinking about the bottom line, right? And you are now beholden to a funder who is only thinking about the bottom line, are you going to prioritize the rights of workers, right? And so you have a very small, ultra-wealthy, what's a better word than predominantly? I mean, overwhelmingly white body that is funding most of the elected officials that are then making these decisions, right? So, and on the flip side, you have those who don't have access to wealth then cannot, or it's very difficult for them to run for office, right? So by our last count, there are what, like 13 senators who are people of color, right? It's not a representative government, both in how, in who they are, in what they represent, in what they care about, and what they prioritize. And so this leads to a deep distrust, understandably, rightfully, in the government, right? This perception that the government does nothing for me, and that's most often true. And that skews policy outcomes that reinforce this economic marginalization and exploitation that we've been talking about. You also have even just the process of influencing decision makers is incredibly elitist, right? There are corporations who hire lobbyists specifically to figure out how to influence policy. That is something that if you don't have specialized expertise and wealth, you cannot access often very easily, right, at the federal level in particular. So this is not a system that is really thinking about the rights, the needs of everyday people, and they don't have access to it. One other aspect of this that I think is really important to bring into the conversation too is the role that this money is playing in shaping our court system, right? The federal judiciary there have been billions of dollars that have been pumped into a corporate, far-right takeover of the judiciary. And so you see the courts being weaponized to dismantle our rights, right? There's so many examples, but even just taking a look at the current Supreme Court term, which is not finished yet, but you have the Alexander decision, right, where the Supreme Court bent over backwards to invalidate two lower court decisions that found a case of racial gerrymandering, and bent over backwards to affirm and uphold a racially gerrymandered map, right, and to replace the decision-making authority of the lower courts with its own interests in doing so, with its own opinions in doing so, and making it much harder to challenge racial gerrymandering moving forward, right? You have extremist legal theories coming from the Fifth Circuit to try to dismantle the Financial Protection Bureau, right? Dismantle consumer protection rights. There's a case that our organization is watching very closely, Loper Bright, which it may not sound very exciting what is it about? It's about agency power. But when you think about it, right, this is a concerted effort to dismantle agency power, specifically the agencies that are protecting workers' rights, the agencies that are protecting our environment, right? This is all part of a plan of deregulation, specifically because these corporate interests it's not in their benefit to have agencies that are protecting workers' rights. So they want to take that power away from agencies with expertise, put it in the hands of these judges who are not experts and who are bought and paid for just in the same way that a lot of other elected officials might be. And the last thing I'll say is just also bringing this down to the very local level. I think it's also important to remember that even just the concept of voting, right? Yes, we'll talk about the electorate I think a little bit later on, but even those who are eligible to vote, right? If you have these extremes of wealth and poverty in our society, if someone has the right to vote but they don't have paid leave, they don't have reliable transportation, they don't have affordable childcare, are they going to show up at the polls? I'll leave it there.
Wow. Okay, Shelley. Moving then to the state level, we've heard what's going on at the federal level. I'd love you to bring in your perspective.
Well, thank you. I start from a more positive view because here I am, elected official. I run for office with the intent to make change. And you will find in the state legislature, for all the flaws that we've discussed here, all of which exist in all of our worlds, there are many, many people of goodwill who are there for the right reasons. Money does have an impact. Racism does have an impact. All these factors exist. But I think at the granular level of running for and then being an elected state official for a long time, like myself, who's viewed as a progressive leader on a bunch of issues, you have to say to yourself, why aren't I hearing enough from the people in my district who are adversely impacted by some of the things you discussed, some of the things each of you discussed? And I think there is this, there's disengagement and cynicism about the political process that seeps into every element of electoral life. And that is very challenging because you want to make change. Let me give an example. So in my district, I am in the suburbs of New York City. A whole lot of people rent their homes and do not own their homes, as is the case in cities throughout the United States. But over the years, homeowners dominated the conversation. They had money, they usually had lobbyists, they had realtors, all of that. Renters were sort of absent until we had a Democratic supermajority in the state Senate, a Democratic supermajority in the Assembly, and frankly, a Democratic governor. We paid no attention to renters. We paid no attention to renters because we don't hear from them. Here we are running. Do we hear from renters? My rent went up. Only when they're on the verge of eviction we hear from them. But as a collective political voice, we don't hear from them. They are disengaged from the process. And yet this is why voting matters, because you need people who are going to say, well, I didn't hear from them. I'm not counting how many emails I got from renters versus homeowners. I still know my job is to fight for the people in my district who are renters, who are completely at the mercy of somebody who's raising their rent willy-nilly for any matter. So that's one of the reasons we did sort of the good cause eviction this year, as imperfect as it was, in the state budget to give non-regulated renters power. But that in part came from both advocacy and hearing from people in the district. The other thing I want to say is that we've changed the rules about voting, in large part about what you're talking about. Early voting came about when the Senate became a Democratic supermajority and the Assembly too. We finally created early voting. They had it in other states. If you didn't have childcare, if you had to work late, you couldn't vote. Now we have 10 days of early voting at sites throughout every district where people can vote in advance. We allowed 17 and 18-year-olds to pre-register to vote so they could be ready to vote when they're 18. But these kinds of changes do require people to be engaged in the political process, notwithstanding its imperfections. So I do want to talk about the fact that in voting, which is relevant to us, who do we hear from and who controls voting? Largely older, whiter, richer voters, and as opposed to in communities like mine, which are immigrant families of mixed status, where there are people who can vote, they are less likely to be voting. Poorer people less likely to be voting, and yet you want someone who's going to be not brave enough, but right enough to do the right policies. We need more people to vote and to be engaged. So we're up against the cynicism and disengagement, partially driven by the financial factors you're describing. And I'll just give one example that we had. My Chief of Staff, Rachel Estroff, is here. We worked on this for many years. I had a big hotel, non-union. On Christmas Eve, two competing forces of financial interests, not a corporation, one guy forcing another guy, both had a lot of money. They fired all the workers on Christmas Eve. Non-union, largely Spanish-speaking, over 250 people. Many had worked there 25, 30 years, but no union, so they had no one to fight for them. They had no one to fight for them, period. They had little access to unemployment. Department of Labor, I love them dearly. They were not good enough. The Attorney General's office, I love them dearly. They were not good enough. We had to fight with every agency and ultimately get them a lawyer and fight for 3 years during the middle of COVID. And ultimately, a judge had the courage to tell these two men, you work it out, and someone's going to pay what is owed to these workers under New York's WARN Act, which does require that you give enough notice when you're going to have a mass layoff. My point is, without a union, without political power, without a will, and without organizing, it is very, very difficult for people without power to exercise it. But that is why voting matters, because you need people who are going to say, I'm going to do the right thing, not always perfectly, subject to political wins, yes. I was going to talk about the Buffalo Bills Stadium, but some things were pressured and forced to do, very frankly, in the legislative process. But at the end of the day, you need people to believe that civic engagement, political engagement, fighting for their interests and the interests of their community is worth it in order for the democracy to survive. I think at the state level, we do far better than the feds right now. There's no question. We're able to do things, accomplish things, compromise, imperfect, but move the needle ahead. But without unions, unions that are forward-thinking, unions that are not dominated by sort of the old-style union leaders, communities of racial activism that challenge the decision-making of to ensure that there is racial justice in the decisions we make, and the voice of the immigrant community. These all have to be part of the process, and we're faced with disengagement and cynicism, and it is a battle for those of us who are elected to try to confront.
Fabulous. So that's a great segue into our next issue. And what I think this panel has brought together in a rich way is the economic power, then how the economic power has taken over the government, the federal government apparatus, and in turn the racialized capitalism that is so deeply ingrained in not only our economy but our political our laws and our government, and then moving to Shelley's examples where the challenge is to how do we overcome this cynicism that has been bred because of this connection between government and the wealthy. So now we get to really turn it around and think about where do we see positive mobilization strategies that our communities are using to really turn this around, because we want to move in that direction in the rest of the session here. So, if each of you can do about 5 minutes, and then we'll do a little bit more on policy per se, and then we really do want to turn it over to the audience. Derek, you want to jump in?
In terms, I mean, I think the first question was like, what are challenges, and was trying to talk honestly about that. But I mean, I also honestly feel pretty inspired every day, seeing all the movement and energy that's especially coming from younger people. Just over the past half decade, I mean, everything from, the big groundswell behind the Bernie Sanders campaign to the massive protests in 2020 around Black Lives Matter and the activism that's grown out of that. This new sort of wave of unionization that we're seeing, and I'll talk about that in a second. I mean, so I feel pretty, I feel pretty, I should say, climate direct action, a lot of young people, a lot of, environmental justice activists really, facing arrest, putting a lot on the line, engaging in direct action for, one of the great crises of our time. There's so much that people are doing here and all over the world that I learn about every day, that I talk to people about every day, that I read about every day, and I try to really ground myself in that every day and stay motivated and inspired, and to try to sort of remember that all that's happening, and that's stuff that that I try to participate in too. So I mean, that said, like I guess I'll just say that, like, I think that, to bring it back to Buffalo, since I'm sort of the Buffalo person up here, I mean, I think that the union drive that began here in Starbucks has been, and now spread to hundreds and hundreds of stores across the country. I think it's really inspiring, and because of the sort of worker-led model that it's organized around, and I think that's something that's sort of really instructive, especially when we talk about all of these industries and employers that are sort of low wage, non-unionized, service sector, retail. Some of them are big stores, but a lot of them are small. Like, how do you organize at scale around that? And I think that, it's just been really important to see out of nowhere, really, almost out of nowhere, a major confrontation with one of the true global powerhouses, of these big industries, and that's succeeded in bringing them to the bargaining table. And I think those sort of you look into how is that happening, right? Much of it is, it's not necessarily staff driven. You have, a lot of internal education going on, workers taking control of their shops, learning from each other, talking to each other. I think that's something that's really, especially, if I think one of the big tasks of the future, which, this seems like a right moment for it, that can hopefully be capitalized on more, is organizing the unorganized. And so seeing examples like that, seeing examples like what the UAW is doing, I think are important.
Thank you. So Nita and Udochi, you really are at the forefront of developing a power agenda at Demos, and one of you and then the other can perhaps really lay out what that consists of and explain, your strategy. So I'll leave it to you to, Udochi, you want to start?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, at Demos, we put out a power agenda in March, and that really is 5 pillars for how we're focusing and thinking about working towards a just, inclusive, multiracial economy and democracy. So I'll take the first 2 pillars related to economics. So our first pillar is economic security for all. And so this is based on the idea that everyone should be able to meet their daily needs. And note that I didn't say basic needs. So I think that we need to really rethink what it means to be economically secure in the richest country in the world, right? Like, not starving is not what we should be going for. Just getting by is not what we should be going for. We can do better, and our floor should be higher. So really thinking about how do we meet daily needs, and when I say needs, I mean mental, physical, emotional, social. How are we making sure that folks just have those needs met? And so there's 3 parts of that. So the first is ensuring that workers can earn a thriving wage without overwork and without exploitation. And I feel very strongly about, if you're making enough to get by or making enough to support yourself and support your family, but you have to do it working 50 hours, you have to do it working 60 hours, you have to go to work and you're subject to retaliation, then you're not economically secure, So people should be able to go to work, make a thriving wage, and not be subject to exploitation or overwork. Another piece is rebalancing power in the workplace, and I know this is something that folks in the room are working and striving for here, but I think everyone's kind of familiar with those charts that show worker productivity going up over the last 50 years, and then workers' wages kind of just doing like this. Right? Like, every time we have those increases in productivity, workers should be getting back either their time or should be getting paid more, and we haven't gotten either. So what are we doing to ensure that workers are gaining that power in the workplace and are actually getting the equitable share of the value that they create? And then the third piece of economic security we have is making sure that there's access, universal access to goods and services that support a comfortable standard of living. I don't have to tell you about our housing crisis, our childcare crisis. That should be accessible, that should be affordable. I don't think that's controversial. Our next big pillar is economic mobility for all. I think we kind of all know that too many people over the course of their lives, they do not see significant increases in their income, they do not see significant increases in wealth. And when we talk about mobility over generations, Black communities are, I think it's 3 times likely to be, or maybe it's twice as likely to being the third generation of poverty, right? And we know that Black and brown folks are in communities where there are not the public goods and services that are helping promote economic mobility. So what do we do? How do we change our financial system? How do we change our tax system to support mobility, both over the course of someone's lives, but also ensure that our children can be guaranteed to do better than what we're doing right now? And I will turn it to Netta for the other pillars.
Sure. So there's three more pillars, so bear with me. So there's full political participation, and when we talk about this, we're really talking about, Senator Mayer beautifully put, how important voting is, but we need better, more pro-voter policies. Very frankly, I mean, right now we're in this unprecedented age of attempts to suppress voting. Right? There's I don't want to get too into the weeds, but in 2013, some folks may be familiar with the Shelby County decision, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act. And since that time, we have seen a lot of states, not New York, but a lot of states really go out of their way to enact voter suppression laws. So for example, in Georgia, there's the SB 202, which is notorious for a number of things, including, criminalizing giving water to folks who are waiting in line to vote, right? But one of the things that it did, which is perhaps not as often talked about, was it made it much harder to vote by mail. And vote by mail, which is incredibly important for exactly the reasons that Senator was talking about, is something that the data has borne out is used predominantly in that state by Black and Asian voters, right? This is not an accident. So we're in this age of voter suppression, and we really need pro-voter policies at the federal level, so that it doesn't matter what state you're in. You have these protections that make it easier to register and to show up at the polls. So things like automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, convenient locations to vote, multiple locations to vote. Those things actually make a huge difference when we're thinking about what full political participation looks like. And the other aspect of that is also direct democracy, right? Which we can talk a little bit more about later in when we're talking about specific policies, but really making sure that people are influencing the politics that directly shape their lives. So the next pillar is more, it's the inclusive and expansive electorate pillar. And this is one that is where actually the majority of my work right now is focused, because it's really thinking about who is eligible to vote, right? So right now, political exclusion is actually perfected because there's an exploitation of both the immigration and the carceral systems to exclude millions of people, right? So we have 4.6 million disenfranchised because of systems, because their systems impacted in some way. We have 19.7 million people who are not naturalized citizens of the US, who live in our communities, who, yes, they pay taxes, which is often, which is an important part of it, but they're also, just by virtue of being our neighbors and being in this community, they have a right to have a say in the policies that are affecting their everyday lives, right? And so really thinking about what are barriers to citizenship, what are barriers to participating in community life, making sure that we have an inclusive and expansive electorate is a huge part of that. And then the final pillar is really talking about representative and accountable government, right? What does it look like? Right now, because of what we've talked about, economic power very often translates into political power. And the infamous Citizens United decision of 2010 being very pivotal in this process of there being unchecked corporate campaign spending. We have to think about, okay, so what does it mean to actually have a financing system, such a small donor public financing, which again, I can get into more in the policy section, but really that make it much easier for people of color to run for office, right? That make it much easier to have communities at the decision-making table, to stop this extreme takeover of the federal judiciary, to bring more transparency and more legibility into the governmental processes. So I will stop there.
Fabulous. So Shali, what I'd love to hear you build on is you talked about voices not being heard. And so in terms of mobilization, do you have examples of people or campaigns that have helped you move forward in the kinds of policies that we want to see passed? And then also maybe morph into the third question we have, which is what are the policies that you see as priorities moving forward?
Well, I think they sort of morph together because there's a number of areas that actually dovetail nicely with some of the DEMO's priorities that we've been working on. And one thing about, if you want to be in the legislature, it's an incremental process. We're not going to, we raised the minimum wage and we got it indexed in New York, but it's not enough to be a living wage. It is enough to be a higher minimum wage than the ridiculous federal minimum wage, and it's better. But to the point you made, Udochi, we are very mindful and have to fight that wages and benefits have to be enough for people to survive and subsist, not just survive and thrive. So, for example, I have a bill for mandatory severance after a long period of employment. They have that in New Jersey. We have been working on it for multiple years. I can't get it passed yet. That's okay. We're in it for the long haul. Mandatory severance after a long period of employment. Why should you work 20 years at Kmart, get laid off one day, and get no severance after you put your whole life into that place, or Toys R Us, or any of these others that largely because of private equity go out of business? This year, we finally increased the TDI, temporary disability insurance benefit, which was so low that it was not, it was a great thing when it was started in the, in the 90s, but the actual amount of money paid for temporary disability insurance was inadequate to live on. We've now finally moving towards increasing it and scaling it to the cost of living now. Another area that we are working on is creating workers' boards, where if a whole segment of the economy is not paid, and I don't mean just wages, wages plus benefits, enough to do well and to live sort of the way one hopes your constituents can live, you could petition the Commissioner of Labor to have a hearing, determine what the appropriate wage and benefits should be, and if this worker board did not agree, that then this new proposed rate would automatically come into effect. That's another thing I've been working on for multiple years. I'm going to continue to be working on. Another in an area we haven't talked about is changing the way utility companies' rates are determined, which right now in my community are driving people out of being able to stay in their homes because they cannot afford the rate of electricity, which is for heat and gas and electricity. So change the dynamic by which the rate is set to a one that is more preferential to ratepayers and not to the companies. That is another sort of incremental change that I am trying to make in order to address the real needs of the people in my community. Not the power interests, not the money interests, but the people that I see every day, the people that I hear from. There's a number of other things that we've done, and one area that we haven't talked about that is crucial for empowering people and creating a true belief in our democracy, which is the equality or greater equity in education funding, something that I have fought extremely hard. We had a foundation aid formula. It was created in 2007. It was supposed to have every school district be paid based on need, not on politics, but it was never fully funded. And we fought with every Democratic governor to get it fully funded. Finally, we got it fully funded. It still does not work. So why should a district like Buffalo be owed millions of dollars when it has substantial need, particularly for a community largely of students of color, largely poorer students, compared to one of the wealthier districts? We need to fix that, and we have been committed to fixing that formula so that it's based actually on economic need of the student, of the community, of the English language learners, of the special needs kids. That should be a fundamental part of this conversation, because we have a whole generation that if they're not educated optimally, they're not going to be able to participate. They're not going to be able to assert their right. They're not going to know enough about the history of America to challenge the racism and other kinds of discrimination that we see all around. So I'm very wedded to the concept that education is part of this conversation along with the rights of workers. And the last thing we didn't talk about that I think is critically important from the standpoint of someone on the ground is the cost of housing. So the cost of housing is so prohibitive in many communities, but certainly downstate New York, such that people really can't afford it, even if they're working 2 or 3 jobs. And we have to address that in a creative way, in a way that is not only for developers and people who make money, but reflects the fact that we have ordinary people who make money, work, and are entitled to live in an affordable, quality housing. And we just have sort of left that area subject to the whims of the developers with money and a few other examples of good planning. So I think, you know, for me, the areas of work, education, housing, healthcare, and the environment, we haven't talked about those, they all fit into this at the end of the day, because whether it's the power of money in campaigns or in elections, or whether it's the disengagement of voters generally, or the unwillingness to engage in civic activity or activism. We need activism in order to push people like myself and my colleagues to always go down the right path. And it's not that we're inclined to go down the other path. It's just that if you count how many emails I get from the people against housing compared to the ones who want more housing in their community, the anti-housing, a lot more emails. And so we need to be engaged, active, pushy, united, and with a loud voice. And the last thing I would just say is a pragmatic thing. It's very important to understand how government works. I mean, we're talking here sort of at a high level, but I'm at a low level. I'm at like hearing from people in a senior center, hearing from people in the supermarket, and then not only how should I vote, what bills should I propose? So I just encourage people to understand this legislative process where really we can make dramatic change, and requires people to understand that particularly at the state and local level, legislative and policy decisions being made by elected officials change people's lives, but we have to get in and fight to make them the right decisions.
Fabulous. Staying true to my word, we have about 5 minutes left, and Shelley has really opened up a landscape of the various policy issues that we really need to address. I want to give each of the panelists just a couple minutes to maybe highlight your priority. Maybe start with Derek and then move to Demos. And then I want to start getting folks up and ready to make comments. We'll have a good half hour then for discussion. Okay, Derek.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of things that I could mention, but I think one thing is that I find really exciting is, you know, locally at municipal levels and state levels all over the country, and including in New York, you're seeing a real growth and revival of movements to sort of take public ownership over and decommodify basic areas of our lives, whether that's like utilities, whether that's finance, you know, public banking, things like that. And I think there's, you know, some pretty vibrant coalitions in New York State, in New York City, and you know that there's you know stuff like this I think being starting to be thought about and pushed forward in Buffalo, and you know there's I haven't followed it super closely, but I think a bill right now that potentially passed like public banking in Rochester.
Yeah. It didn't pass.
It didn't pass. Okay.
No, it did
well,
not. Did not. Not pass.
But you know, this is a long struggle, right? And you know, the Public Renewables Act did pass,
Yes.
and so you know, and you've had also victories in California, and so I mean, I think this is, but I think overall, like this is emerging as a really exciting policy, like movement area, you know, built on broad coalitions. That is a really important sort of arm of this new kind of, new sort of progressive movement we've been seeing grow over the last 5-10 years.
Great. Okay.
Happy to go next. So one issue in the worker rights space especially that really want to dig in on Demos is overwork and the idea of how work fits into our lives. So raise your hand if you've ever come home exhausted from work. Raise your hand if you have not been able to go to the doctor or care for a loved one or vote because of work. Why? Like why in this country are we why are we like this? There's no federal right to rest breaks. There's no federal right to meal breaks. Millions of workers are cut out of the Family Medical Leave Act, which entitles workers to 12 weeks unpaid off to care for themselves, care for a new child, or to care for others. It is it is beyond me why we have an economy that is set up to extract the most from workers, but not recognize that they are human beings that should be entitled to basic rights. So how do we make a workplace that really respects workers and respects their time and creates a situation where we aren't trying to fit our lives around work, but work is fitting itself around our lives? So what do those policies look like, and how are we doing that? Another big issue that we're going to work on is public investments for public good. You know, we just saw trillions of dollars passed, and we got some good wins on how to make sure those dollars are spent well, but there's a lot of incentives and not a lot of requirements. And like, how do we actually make sure if money is going out the door from the federal government, it's going to make for good jobs? It's going to require Davis-Bacon. It's going to require CBAs. How do we really make sure that there are requirements and not negotiable, instead of just like suggestions that you can get a tax refund on? So like, how do we really make sure that is how the government operates and not just nice to have?
Yeah, so really quick, just a few more ideas. Something that Demos is really interested in learning more about, really, when we think about the localities, right, cities and towns being the laboratories of democracy, there are a lot of initiatives that are popping up at the local level and the state level that are really, really interesting and exciting. So one is small donor public financing, right? So something that has already been implemented in 14 states and I think 26 localities, where it's an alternative financing scheme, where those who want to run for office, instead of taking money from those larger donors, they can basically enter into a program where every small donation that they get is matched by the government using public funds, right? And so there's different, this can look a lot of different ways. In New York City, it's like an 8-to-1 match. In Seattle, I think they give vouchers to residents. In states like Arizona, they do a block grant. So it can look a number of different ways, but really the benefits of this is that it develops deeper trust and connection between elected officials and the communities that they serve. They're spending all their time in community and building greater bonds. Folks are more invested in the process and more connected to their decision makers. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is direct democracy, right? So processes like ballot initiatives and referendums, right, are incredibly important. And actually right now, there's a lot of concerted effort to try to limit those rights for this reason, right? We're seeing this in the area of reproductive rights, but in a number of areas where those are being put up for ballot initiatives, and certain lawmakers are not happy about that and are trying to restrict that right. So it's incredibly important to preserve those. But at the end of the day, that will only get us so far, because it still requires resources to even have the will to get something onto the ballot. So there are, for example, Oregon has codified something called civic assemblies, and I've seen it referred to as jury duty for lawmaking, which I'm like, I don't know that you're selling it when you call it that, but the idea is really that, there are these civic assemblies of, randomly selected folks get mailers in the mail, and then those that opt in are put on these randomly selected panels that are supposed to be representative of the community. And those panels get together to deliberate on specific issues and come to, create fact sheets. So in Oregon, for example, they create fact sheets after talking to experts and doing research for voters on what is actually going to be on the ballot in a given election. In other countries, actually, where this is experimented with a lot, more pressing issues like environmental rights, abortion, things like that, are actually put to civic assemblies that make recommendations to lawmakers. Now, of course, the lawmakers actually have to act on those recommendations and not let them sit, right? So there needs to be continual accountability. And then I know this has already been discussed today in previous panels, so I won't spend too much time on it, but also just participatory budgeting, right? Being a really powerful tool when it is actually enacted appropriately, and there's significant funds, and folks who have city residents have the power to determine how a portion of the city budget is spent are actually empowered to do so. So those are just some of the things that we're seeing that are really, really exciting.
Thank you all of you for a great set of comments and ideas. And now what I want to do is take some questions and comments from the audience. I think we'll take a couple, and then, or maybe three, and we'll see how it goes, and then different panelists can respond as you see fit. And please tell us your name.
Thank you. I'm Nathan Lamb from the Cornell ILR Climate Jobs Institute, but my question certainly is not from my official role. So I'd like to thank Senator Mayer for the candid framing of, you just don't hear from working class folks as much as you hear from, richer folks and folks from special interests. And I think it makes me think of a quote from the Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., riots are the language of the unheard. And in this post-2020 society we live in, I feel like we really have not done a great job with reckoning with what happened, especially through the summer of 2020. We're seeing, across the U.S. as a whole, but in New York State certainly, the propagation of these police urban warfare training centers, colloquially referred to as cop cities. 2 of them are being built in Western New York, and 1 of them is being built in Queens, where I live. And the bloat of police budgets continuing. And this seems like something where the working class and non-civically engaged folk are not anywhere close in lockstep with where the debate is at and where the discourse is at in terms of what's actually happening in legislative and regulatory spaces. And I would want to ask, how do we confront this discord between where policy is heading and where people are feeling, and how do we avoid sort of this continued militarization of our civic spaces through the police? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah Quigley. I am one of the ILR High Road Fellows for summer 2024, and my question is kind of tailored to Netta. I know you were talking a lot about one of the platforms being expanding the electorate and also mentioning the big financial influence that the corporate and the right have on the judiciary. So my question was just, what should groups like the American Constitution Society or other groups do to combat groups like the Federalist Society that, are putting all this money into the judiciary and sort of balancing out that influence? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Savannah Rostad, and I'm also one of the High Road Fellows this year. When we talk about the economy, I think a lot of people see that as something separate from themselves, especially working people. And my question is, how does mutual aid, cooperative housing, and other grassroots economic activity fit into the fight for democracy?
Great. We're gonna go with those 3 questions. We've got 1 more, and I encourage a few more of you to come up. We have enough time for additional questions, so while these questions are being answered, please think of coming up to the mic. I'm gonna leave it up to all of you to decide which ones you want to address.
Well, I'll just jump in on actually a little bit on the first 2. So on the issues of sort of really dominance of the police voice in policy decision-making, which I think is at the essence of what you're talking about, we certainly confronted it in the legislature pre-2020 when we changed some of the most egregious rules. We changed bail, which caused nothing but fire to come out of people's hair in our districts. In a way that was based on the rational system that bail is to ensure that people return to court. And we tried to distinguish between serious felonies and non-serious, non-violent crimes, and we've changed it 3 times. But at that time, and then we took on the ability of individual citizens to get the records of police disciplinary records in New York, which was another thing that caused just, incredible political fighting at our local level. At the end of the day, I think there was a recognition, notwithstanding what you said, that the police world had too much influence on policymakers across the board. And to the credit of the leadership in our House, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, who's the majority leader, and Carl Hastie, 2 people of color, we collectively pushed back against that. And we also got the police unions in New York, not across the board, but many of them, to change their view. That in fact, they're gonna have to work with us. We are not gonna be the old style Republicans who just do whatever they say. And so there has been a change in some of the union leadership, not across the board, but the tone has been changed. That they have to deal with us and they have to come to the table with ideas. Now, I think you're right to highlight, there's always the danger that they reassert their sort of traditional power, and they have political power. That's the other thing. They use their political power in these elections. And that's why it matters who else is out there. Otherwise, you're going to lose. You, as a Democrat who voted for bail reform, are going to lose if the police union organizes and spends all their money to defeat you. And that happened to some of my colleagues. So my point is, at the same time, you need them to sort of wise up that the world has changed. And the world changed after 2020 for much of the United States that had never really come to terms with the inherent racism of our society and our justice system. But at the same time, we need people who are willing to say, I'm going to vote for you, even though you voted for something that you're getting bashed over the head with. Otherwise, you're going to lose and go back to having a fairly conservative majority in these state houses, which we have in many, many other states. We're lucky in New York, even if it's not perfect, that we are not in that place. So that's one point. The other thing is on the judiciary, the question was asked, you know, we in the Senate who had the chance to confirm the chief judge rejected the governor's choice for chief judge for a number of reasons, including his decision in labor cases, including his perspective on jurors, and we selected a different person who had a far more open view of the need to reform court culture. And I think I'm quite convinced we did the right thing, notwithstanding that we made enemies in the process. Thank you. Yes, we did the right thing. And but my point is, these things are not divorced from electoral politics. So we decided who the chief judge was. The governor thought she should decide. She had the ability to appoint, but we had the ability to confirm, and we rejected her judge. And we picked someone who we thought was going to sit in a family court. In fact, yesterday they told me they went to family court in the Bronx and took judges so they could see one-on-one the experience of people in family court, which is too often ignored by judges at a high level. So electoral politics, and I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but electoral politics really matters in changing these policies that we're talking about.
I agree, and just to jump on that, I absolutely agree. When we're thinking about the federal judiciary, I think for a long time, I don't know if it's actually true anymore, but I think for a long time, you know, the court really enjoyed this mystique, right? This notion of, oh, we're above politics and we're not influenced by that, and you know, oh, we're appointed for life, so we don't have to worry about. And I think nothing could be further from the truth in terms of them being above politics. But I think now folks are starting to talk about the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court, and I think that is an important step in starting to question. Well, why is it that Justice Alito did not recuse himself from certain cases after Flaggate, right? Or like, you know, things like that, because the Supreme Court doesn't have a binding code of ethics, right? I mean, the state judges do. So the federal judiciary, so, you know, things like that. So I think it's about, you know, starting to talk more about the court and really put scrutiny on it to remove this aura that they have enjoyed for far too long. And then when we're thinking about specific things, I agree. The electoral politics is so much at the heart of this because we need to pressure Congress to enact more reforms that specifically touch on the court, right? There are certain constitutional issues that they obviously can't touch because of separation of powers, but they can impose a binding court of, code of ethics. They can expand the court, right? They can put more justices on the Supreme Court. They can impose term limits, right? There are things that they can do that, you know, anyone in isolation, I don't know is actually going to do anything, and could just end up packing the court with, you know, more extremist judges. But you know, if we view court reform as a package at the federal level and as something that is really about engaging with Congress, with Congress and pushing Congress for, then I think that's where we can start to see a change. And we really have to make it clear that, like, the court is not this plaything, this battleground for these moneyed corporate interests to just push their own agenda, right? That is what we need to counter.
So others who want to jump in on these questions?
I'll just say something about the person who asked about Cop City in Atlanta. Just this total coincidence, I was interviewing two people yesterday for something that from Atlanta that are organizing around Cop City. And they, one of the things that they said is that, this should concern everybody because this is going to be the model for the rest of the country. And we're starting to see, this recent proposal or idea that's floating, I guess, in New York City. But I think it's important to understand, like, something like Cop City is emblematic of the sort of nexus of corporate power and police power. Because if you look at what Cop City is, it's not just something where the Atlanta Police Department just came and said, hey, we need to build this enormously expensive, huge, training facility, right? It was something that's been, largely funded and pushed by huge corporate donations through the Atlanta Police Foundation that are headquartered in and around Atlanta, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, Chick-fil-A, whatever it's called, and so on and so on. The police foundations like this exist all over the country, right? They're basically nonprofit arms of police departments through which corporations can funnel millions of dollars into police departments for all types of things without the usual scrutiny that they would get on, with a normal budgetary process, right? And so, and they have, galas and golfing events every year where you have, the members of the, of representatives from the corporations and leaders from the police kind of schmoozing with each other. The corporations sit on the board of these police foundations. And, this is what is, has been the driving force behind Cop City in Atlanta. And, the last thing I'll say is one of the things that these organizers kept bringing up is they see this really connected to an ever-increasing, deepened desire by the big interests in the city, especially, real estate interests, to have a tight alliance with the police, to increase police power when it comes to things like, policing gentrification, and just a host of other things. So I think that when we talk about something like Cop City, something like police power, it also needs to be really be understood in not just kind of abstract ways, but in pretty concrete ways, as something that's pretty tied to corporate power in cities.
Do you want to respond, or should we go on with other questions? Okay, should we just, okay, so we have 3 more questions. I'll do these 2 over here and then come over here. And go ahead.
Thanks so much. I want to thank you for your time. I'm Henry Nowak. I'm starting my first year at law school at UB in the fall. Thank you.
Excellent law school.
Thanks. So I had 2 questions, so I'll be brief. The first one, I have members of my family who really don't support the government, and they think there should be a lot of deregulation, and it's hard to talk to them at like family events and stuff like that. So I was curious, any advice you would have for somebody who's looking to help a family member out to have more trust in the government, perhaps. And the second thing you talk
Drink
about—
more at your Thanksgiving.
you talk about having people above just the living wage where they would need to survive, and so I was curious about your thoughts on universal basic income. That was my second one.
You want to speak about that? That's probably in the DEMOS list.
Yes, so we are,
No, we're going to take 2 more questions and then we'll.
Hi, I'm Daniela. I'm a High Road Fellow. I was just wondering, like, looking at democracy through the lens of mass incarceration, do you think that the prison system should be kind of on the forefront of, democratic revolution, or do you think that that's something that will come with other, outside, with working kind of from the outside into prison? Basically, do we start with the people who have the least amount of freedom and the least amount of democracy in their lives, or do we do like a trickle-down thing where it starts with people who are on the outside and have more democracy, and then it goes that those changes kind of weave themselves into incarceration?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Katrina. I'm also a High Road Fellow. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and one big thing that's happening right now in my neighborhood is mass gentrification, mass white flight, but now white flight is coming back to New York City because of a lot of the cultural aspects that are in Brooklyn. And I hear a lot of talks from my family and also people that are in my community saying that I don't trust the government. The government has never done anything for me. They continue to don't do anything for me. So why would I vote? Why would I participate? And I guess my question is, how do you get people to engage in voting in a polarized political climate that has caused people to lose faith in the system, and also in a climate that was never, whose foundations weren't really meant for people of color, women, other disenfranchised groups?
Let's take one more, the last question.
Hi, my name is Angelugas. My question was for Derek on, do you have any recommendations for how our side can support also news and journalism? Because like some of the things that have come up, like with the ProPublica and Justice Thomas and there's the investigative post is here. So a lot of, in Cop City, a lot of the work is not done by mainstream media bringing these issues to light. So how can the community and people here support journalism, especially in a time right now?
Great. Okay, I'm going to let each of you choose the questions you want to, maybe beginning wherever you want to. Udochi?
I was trying to remember all the questions. The first question about deregulation, I don't know where you are, but have you ever had your family read The Jungle or any books like that to remind them of what it looked like when the US government didn't regulate our industries? Like, it's pretty bad. Like, child labor was a thing, bad meat was a thing. Those protections are pretty, I think we take it as for granted that we have those protections, but they're pretty integral to a functioning society. And I appreciate there's a lot of rhetoric out there, especially from corporate interests, about how if we deregulate the economy, we'll be better off. But I don't know if there's evidence of that. And I don't know your family, but I assume that most of them work. And what would it be like for them if there was no minimum wage or there's no overtime protections? I don't think they would enjoy work more if we deregulated our economy. So very practically, regulations protect workers, they protect consumers, and corporations telling you that we're better off without them are just a bunch of lies. On UBI, so I love the conversation about UBI, but I think it needs to be married with a conversation about universal basic services as well. So the one thing I'll say about UBI is I really love that there's increased conversation about it. I will say something slightly controversial, but EITC and other federal programs that depend, that you have to get benefits because you work, feel problematic. And I think we need to get to a place where there is universal access to financial support, and people do not have to climb through hoops to access it or to be eligible. And we need to stop shaming people for needing or wanting access to those benefits. And if we have a universal type program, I think we get closer to that. And I think we have to marry it to universal basic services, because I come from a very small town in Mississippi. Access to services is a huge problem. So even if folks had the money in their pockets, they might not be able to find a suitable childcare place that's high quality. They might not be able to actually access the services. So making it so that there's public options where the government is providing services and that they are in our communities, and regardless of whether people are getting government assistance or not, there's access to those services is extremely important, because if we're not having that public option and that opportunity, we have what we have now, where corporations are making the decision of whether or not grocery stores are going to be in certain areas, or whether or not this community deserves to have, these basic services. So I think we need to marry those two ideas, and I think that gets us closer to having folks have their needs met.
I'll leave it to you.
Well, I'm just going to say, on this issue of family members feeling very disengaged and cynical and unimpressed by sort of the pieces of our democracy that do work well, like having minimum wage laws, having wage and hour protection, having Medicare, having Social Security. These are things that people fought for and actually benefit huge numbers of people, but people, I think for a number of reasons, feel very disengaged. I think one thing that we try very hard, and my colleagues, I would say, across the board try this, is to help people with problems that have nothing to do with government. Like the frustration with the operation of government is great. Like I can't go to DMV and get my license fixed on a Sunday, but I'm only off on a Sunday. Why is that? You know, our agencies and other elements of government don't work well enough for people. So we as elected officials have to really be empathetic and be advocates for our constituents. Then they get more comfortable. Oh, you mean somebody actually answered my phone call? Somebody tried to help me with something that has nothing to do with politics? I didn't vote for you. I don't even vote. But you helped me with the problem. That's sort of how you build support among people who are disengaged from the political process and don't believe. Because part of it is that they don't know anyone who really does exhibit caring about them or a drive to make things better. The other point is, given how polarized our political debate is, people are afraid to say things because they're afraid they're going to be criticized. And I think that happens in families too. Like, I don't need to talk about, I'm not talking about politics at Thanksgiving because I'm not going to be able to talk to my uncle ever again after, you know, he's for Trump. So, okay, that's the end of that. So we've gotten to a place where it's very hard for people to listen respectfully to different opinions. And that makes people, in my opinion, this is just the way I believe it, very disengaged from believing that participation in anything will make a difference. That's why being in a PTA, being in a community group, being in your housing association group, those are sort of the entry-level points that make people, in my opinion, believe that there's some good in collective action. But it is very difficult in this moment of highly polarized thinking where people are afraid to voice an opinion or afraid to listen to someone who disagrees. It is a difficult time in families, and I see that all across my community as well. It's very disturbing for people who really believe that, you know, believe in the promise of American democracy, that people feel that way. And I think we collectively as advocates and activists have to work to change that. We cannot have hatred be the dominant theme in our politics. I blame Trump for it, but we have to do more to fix it.
So last thoughts from Nita and then Derek.
Sure, I can quickly jump in. Drawing from my work, really trying to advocate for non-citizen voting, which is right now illegal at the state and federal level, but a handful of cities across the country have implemented this and are fighting hard to keep those rights where it is implemented. You know, first, on the question of family members, I like to use this example to demonstrate the power of messaging. So my family, you know, I'm the daughter of immigrants. My whole family is Iranian, as is my husband's family, and fled religious persecution. And when my father heard that I was working on non-citizen voting, he was like, oh, I'm dead against that. Dad, you're an immigrant. What are you talking about, right? And, you know, my dad had, and it took him like 30 years to naturalize, you know, and so I continue to think about that example because it really shows that, you know, the power of messaging, right? Non-citizen voting was actually legal and very widespread in the US before the 1920s, right? It's a very recent phenomenon that we don't allow non-citizens to vote. And so I think that speaks to the power of messaging. And so, you know, really figuring out ways to get people to connect to real stories. This is a theme that I've heard throughout this conference about, you know, it's hard work to get people to understand what it means for someone with lived experience when you don't have that experience. And so in my work talking to different nonprofits, as I, you know, think about how to collaborate on these non-citizen voting projects, messaging continually comes up. And I think it's something that especially advocates really need to think about how we help shape. What resources are we creating? How are we controlling the narrative? How are we helping our lawmakers, you know, with this messaging to try to gain support for rights that, you know, that might not necessarily affect us. So I bring this up specifically, in the context of not only the family question, but also when we think about the carceral system and folks who are disenfranchised. I don't personally think that the trickle-down system is going to work. I think that this does need to be something that we fight very, very hard for. I mean, there is proposed legislation, the Inclusive Democracy Act, specifically around abolishing penal disenfranchisement, right? But I think that those are rights that we need to affirmatively fight for. Rethinking the carceral system that is working exactly as it was designed and is not something that can be fixed is something that needs to be very affirmatively fought for. And it's really hard work, but we have to do these things, right? We have to. The way I think about it, I was talking to an advocate about non-citizen voting, and the way he described why he does this work, he's working on the campaign right now in Santa Ana, is he said, this is the least paternalistic way that we can empower these communities, right? Ultimately, when you give folks the right to vote, even when their system's impacted, even when they, are not U.S. citizens, you are allowing them to have a voice in what they, in the policies that shape their lives. So I think we need to continually fight to empower more people with their democratic rights and their economic rights, and not just expect that this is something that will eventually sort itself out.
Derek, do you want to end on?
Yeah, I'll be, just one thing real quick before I forget. It's really great to be in this room with all the summer fellows. I've been in Buffalo for 11 years and come across a lot of the summer fellows who have always, been amazing people, remained friends with some of them, energetic, doing great things, and, important parts of playing important roles in the movement. So it's great that you're here. It's really cool that you get to experience all this through Buffalo, and look forward to seeing all the wonderful things that you're going to do. I was just talking to someone today who I met, I think 10 years ago, who was, or maybe it was less than that, but a fellow who's doing great stuff with the labor movement. But on the journalism question, I don't think there's any easy answers here. I would say just, most immediately, support support the journalism that you like, subscribe, things like that. If there's legislation, policies come along, more public funding for journalism would be great. But I think there's more we could say about all the sort of smaller concrete things. But I think the bigger thing is build the movement, right? The more that we're able to have a powerful progressive force in the U.S., the more we're going to be able to preserve and take on the opponents of public goods, like those who like the forces that are degrading journalism. So I really think that that's more broadly the kind of North Star, the big picture. Like this, it's a larger political problem. What's happening, the crisis in journalism, and so I think that's really important to keep that in mind. That that will go as goes. The sort of the rest of the boat.
Well, with that, I want to thank all of you for being part of this Friday afternoon session that was so instructive. I really want to thank all of you for participating and really prepping. It's very clear you all thought very hard before and about what you were going to say, and I really appreciate that. And we're now going to turn it over to Kathy, who's going to give us some help on logistics for the afternoon field trips. Thank you.
Yeah, if you're feeling bad, it's great to know that we have a friend in government who's so progressive. Thank you. That really is very uplifting for me personally. Thank you, Shelley. All right, what's going to happen now is that there's still time to make a blue flag. If you want to make a blue flag, it's 3:47. We're going to go outside and get on the bus of the field trip that you picked, if you picked a field trip. Now, because we have certain limitations on the number of seats in the bus, if you signed up for a particular bus, a field trip, you have to go stay on that one. Sorry, guys. And people are going to be outside to the left with signs. So field trip, flags, and then tomorrow morning we'll be back here for a morning program. We'll have breakfast here. The program is going to be really great. It's going to be talking about what people are doing at the local level to make change. So we'll hope to see you all back tomorrow. And I hope everybody had a good time today and feels inspired.